Welcome to this remarkable war survival chronicle, where forgotten civilian wisdom met the collapse of armies and nations. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time this story found you. These quiet war stories often travel farther than battles ever did. The discovery came in 1967, buried beneath stacks of water-damaged municipal records from Marion County, Indiana. A yellowed requisition form dated March 15, 1945, listed an unusual request typed on what appeared to be a civilian typewriter: emergency food preparation assistance, civilian volunteer, non-compensated. The signature belonged to someone named Cordelia Voss, written in distinctive violet ink that had somehow resisted 22 years of basement storage. That name appeared nowhere else in the official wartime documentation for the entire county. Yet, according to the carbon copy filed directly beneath it, her intervention had somehow sustained an entire medical unit when their supply lines collapsed during the brutal final weeks of the European War. But what caught the attention of the graduate student examining these records wasn't the signature or even the unusual nature of the request. It was the meticulous handwritten notes scrawled in the margins, documenting precise measurements, timing intervals, and temperature readings that suggested someone had been conducting systematic food preservation experiments on a scale far beyond anything typically managed by civilian volunteers during the war years. The notes referenced barrel numbers, batch dates, and salt concentrations with the precision of a laboratory scientist. Yet they were written in the careful script of someone who had never received formal scientific training. The story begins 2 miles outside Martinsville, Indiana, where the old Baltimore and Ohio Railroad depot still carries deep scorch marks from a transformer explosion that knocked out electrical power to half the county on February 28, 1945. The war in Europe was grinding toward its conclusion, but American soil was experiencing its own logistical nightmare that historians rarely mention in their accounts of the period. Severe fuel shortages, cascading equipment breakdowns, and the harshest winter weather Indiana had experienced in 30 years had created supply bottlenecks that left military installations across the Midwest scrambling for basic necessities that had been taken for granted just months earlier. Railroad schedules had become completely unreliable. Coal supplies for heating were running dangerously low across the region. Emergency generators were failing at critical moments due to lack of proper maintenance and fuel shortages. The civilian infrastructure that supported military operations was breaking down in ways that military planners had never anticipated when they designed their logistics systems around the assumption that basic utilities and transportation would remain functional throughout the conflict. Cordelia Voss had been living completely alone in a converted farmhouse since receiving the War Department telegram, informing her that her husband's engineering unit was reported missing near Bastonia 4 months earlier. No further details. No personal effects returned, no body recovered. Simply missing, with the implication that hope should be maintained, but preparations for the worst should begin immediately. The official language of the telegram suggested that families should expect no additional information until the conclusion of hostilities, whenever that might occur. The house sat on 17 acres of frozen ground, most of it completely worthless for traditional agriculture, but ideally suited for something else entirely. The previous owner had used the land for raising root vegetables, leaving behind a network of cold storage cellars and root houses that most people would have considered obsolete in the modern era. Cordelia had inherited not just the property, but also the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived harsh winters without electric refrigeration or reliable supply chains. In the basement, accessible through a narrow wooden staircase that creaked ominously under even modest weight, she had been conducting an ongoing experiment that would have seemed utterly unremarkable to her grandmother, but revolutionary to a generation raised almost entirely on factory-processed foods. The basement maintained a consistent temperature year-round, hovering between 42 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit, making it ideal for controlled fermentation processes that required precise environmental conditions. The technique was deceptively simple in principle, but demanding in execution. Using nothing but root vegetables, coarse salt, and controlled fermentation conducted in wooden barrels salvaged from a defunct whiskey distillery 12 miles away. She had developed a preservation method that could stretch basic rations indefinitely while actually improving their nutritional value. The process required no electricity, no special equipment, and no ingredients that couldn't be found in any abandoned farm cellar or rural basement. What made it remarkable wasn't the complexity, but the timing, and the systematic way she had refined every detail through months of careful observation and adjustment. The whiskey barrels had been abandoned when Prohibition enforcement had shut down rural distilleries across the county. Most people considered them worthless, but Cordelia recognized their potential for food storage. The oak wood had absorbed enough natural preservative compounds during its years of alcohol production to create an ideal environment for controlled fermentation. She had spent weeks cleaning and reconditioning the barrels, removing all traces of alcohol, while preserving the beneficial properties of the aged wood. On March 3, 1945, during a blizzard that had closed most roads in the county for 3 consecutive days, a military truck carrying medical supplies broke down exactly 312 yards from her property line. The vehicle was part of a convoy attempting to reach a temporary field hospital that had been hastily established in the old Martinsville High School gymnasium when the regular medical facility lost its heating system during the February power outages. The regular hospital had become unusable when its coal furnace failed, and replacement parts proved impossible to obtain during the ongoing supply crisis. Inside the stranded truck were 12 wounded soldiers and 2 medics who had been traveling for 18 hours without any hot food whatsoever. Their emergency rations had been consumed the previous day, and the next scheduled supply convoy wasn't expected to arrive for another 48 hours, assuming the roads could be cleared and additional fuel could be located. The men were showing early signs of exposure and malnutrition, conditions that could become life-threatening if they couldn't get proper nutrition soon. The medic who knocked on Cordelia's door through the driving snow later described the encounter in remarkable detail in a letter to his wife, discovered among his personal effects when she donated them to the Veterans Administration in 1963. He wrote, "The woman didn't ask a single question about who we were or what we needed. She just took one look at our situation and started moving with a kind of quiet efficiency I'd never seen before, not even among the most experienced military personnel. Within 20 minutes, she had provided enough food to keep all of us going for 3 full days. But it wasn't just the quantity that surprised us. It was the quality. Somehow, she had taken what looked like kitchen scraps and spoiled vegetables and turned them into something that actually restored our strength in a way that regular rations never seemed to accomplish." What the medic couldn't have known was that Cordelia had been observing their approach for nearly an hour before they reached her door. She had watched through her kitchen window as they struggled through the snow, assessed their condition, and begun preparing food before they ever knocked. Her preparation wasn't based on charity or emotional impulse, but on practical calculation of what would be required to restore their strength and get them back on the road safely. The fermentation process Cordelia had perfected over months of experimentation allowed her to transform damaged or partially spoiled vegetables into concentrated, nutrient-dense pastes that could be mixed with water or broth to create filling, energizing meals that were far superior to standard military rations. The technique involved layering carefully chopped vegetables with precisely measured amounts of coarse salt in wooden barrels, then controlling the temperature and moisture levels to encourage specific types of bacterial growth while preventing the development of harmful microorganisms. The process began with root vegetables that were past their prime for normal consumption but still contained valuable nutrients. Potatoes that had begun to sprout, carrots that had become soft, turnips that were developing dark spots, all vegetables that would normally be discarded, became the foundation for her preservation system. She would clean them carefully, removing any portions that showed signs of dangerous decay, then chop them into uniform pieces that would ferment evenly. After exactly 3 weeks, monitored daily with a thermometer salvaged from her late husband's workshop, the mixture would develop into a concentrated food source that could be stored without refrigeration for months without any deterioration in quality or nutritional value. The fermentation process actually increased the bioavailability of certain vitamins while creating new nutrients that weren't present in the original vegetables. The result was a food source that was more nutritious than the original ingredients had been when fresh. What the medics couldn't have known, and what Cordelia never explained to them during that first encounter, was that she had been refining this process systematically since November 1944, when increasingly severe rationing had made fresh food progressively more scarce throughout rural Indiana. She had started with her own kitchen scraps, testing different combinations of vegetables, salt ratios, and timing intervals until she could reliably produce batches that were both completely safe for consumption and remarkably nutritious. The systematic approach had required her to maintain detailed records of every variable in the process. She documented which vegetables worked best in combination, how salt concentrations affected fermentation speed, what temperature ranges produced the safest results, and how different storage conditions affected the final product. By the time that military truck broke down near her property during the March blizzard, she had accumulated enough preserved food in her basement to feed a small army for weeks, along with the knowledge to produce more whenever needed. The real test of her system came when word began to spread through informal military channels about Cordelia's unexpected contribution to the stranded medical unit. Within a week of that first encounter, 3 additional vehicles had stopped at her farmhouse, each carrying personnel who had been struggling with inadequate or spoiled rations for days. Military supply chains throughout the region were failing with increasing frequency, leaving units stranded without adequate nutrition for extended periods. She provided food for all of them, never asking for payment or official recognition, never requesting any form of compensation. Her only requirement was that they bring their own containers and listen carefully to her detailed instructions about proper preparation and consumption of the fermented foods. The preparation instructions were crucial because improper handling could neutralize the nutritional benefits or even create safety risks. The fermentation method required absolutely specific attention to timing and temperature, details that could mean the literal difference between safe consumption and serious illness or even death. Cordelia insisted on personally demonstrating the entire process to anyone who wanted to learn, effectively turning her cramped basement into an informal but highly practical classroom where military cooks and medics could observe the technique firsthand and ask detailed questions about implementation. Several of them later successfully implemented similar systems at their own installations, creating a quiet network of enhanced food security that operated completely outside official channels during the war's final months. The network grew through personal recommendations rather than official directives. Soldiers who had experienced the benefits of Cordelia's preserved foods would seek out her instruction, learn the technique, then implement it at their own bases and teach others in turn. But the story might have ended there, forgotten among the countless small acts of civilian support that sustained the war effort across America. If not for a supply crisis that struck the entire region in mid-March, when a late winter storm system knocked out several key railway bridges and completely closed the primary highways for nearly a week. The storm was unprecedented in its intensity and duration, creating conditions that overwhelmed even the emergency protocols that had been developed for wartime supply interruptions. The storm stranded 2 separate medical units without adequate food for what stretched into nearly a full week of isolation. The official military supply chain couldn't reach them through conventional channels, but Cordelia's growing informal network could. The network had developed knowledge of alternative transportation routes, civilian volunteers with vehicles, and most importantly, distributed food storage that didn't depend on centralized supply chains. Using a carefully coordinated combination of civilian vehicles, local knowledge of back roads that weren't marked on any military maps, and volunteers who knew exactly which routes remained passable during severe weather, she coordinated the delivery of preserved food to both isolated locations. The entire operation required no official authorization, no bureaucratic paperwork, and no military approval. It simply happened quietly and efficiently because someone had taken the time to prepare systematically for exactly this kind of emergency and had built the relationships necessary to respond effectively when the crisis actually occurred. The coordination effort revealed the extent to which Cordelia had been building relationships throughout the region. Farmers who had learned her preservation techniques, civilian drivers who had witnessed military vehicles stopping at her farmhouse, local mechanics who had helped repair stranded military trucks, all of them had become informal participants in a network that could respond to emergencies more quickly than official channels. The medical officer who documented the incident in his official report noted that the civilian-provided food not only sustained his personnel through the crisis, but actually improved their overall physical condition compared to standard military rations they had been consuming for weeks. The fermented vegetables provided essential vitamins and minerals that had been completely absent from their diet, nutrients that couldn't be obtained from processed rations. Several soldiers who had been showing early signs of nutritional deficiency recovered completely within days of receiving Cordelia's preserved foods, regaining energy and mental clarity that had been gradually deteriorating. The improvement in the soldiers' condition was dramatic enough that the medical officer began requesting regular supplies of the preserved foods for his unit. His official reports documented measurable improvements in energy levels, recovery rates from minor injuries, and overall morale among personnel who had access to Cordelia's fermented vegetables compared to those subsisting entirely on standard rations. The technique itself wasn't complicated enough to require extensive written instructions or formal training programs. It relied on fundamental principles that had been common knowledge in rural communities for generations. Proper salt ratios for preservation, temperature control for safety, and patience for the biological processes to develop correctly. What made Cordelia's application unique was her systematic approach to scaling the process beyond family needs, and her willingness to share the knowledge freely with anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to provide anything in return. By April 1945, when regular supply lines had finally been restored and the immediate crisis had passed, at least 6 different military installations across Indiana were using variations of Cordelia's preservation method to supplement their official rations. The technique had been adapted for different scales of operation, from individual mess halls to large hospital kitchens. Each installation had modified the basic process to work with their available equipment and local food sources. The knowledge had spread through completely informal channels, person to person, without any official recognition or documentation by military authorities. It was exactly the kind of practical wisdom that tends to disappear entirely from historical records, preserved only in personal letters, private diaries, and unofficial reports that never make their way into official archives. Military bureaucracy was focused on standardized procedures and official supply chains, not innovative solutions developed by civilians. The war ended in Europe before anyone in the military bureaucracy thought to formally study or document the technique that had quietly sustained dozens of soldiers through critical shortages. Cordelia returned to her solitary life on the farmhouse property, continuing to use the fermentation method for her own survival needs, but no longer called upon to feed stranded soldiers or coordinate emergency food deliveries. The wooden barrels in her basement gradually emptied as she consumed her remaining preserved foods, and the makeshift classroom where she had taught preservation techniques was slowly converted back to ordinary storage space. The transition back to peacetime meant that the supply problems that had made her technique so valuable gradually disappeared. Regular food supplies resumed, military installations were decommissioned or returned to their normal operations, and the informal networks that had developed during the crisis were no longer needed. What had been essential knowledge during wartime became merely an interesting historical footnote in an era of abundance. The discovery of her contribution came about through pure accident 22 years later. In 1967, a graduate student researching wartime logistics was methodically reviewing bureaucratic requisition forms when he noticed an unusual pattern of food-related emergency requests from Marion County. All of them referenced the same civilian contact, and all of them had been resolved without any apparent official supply chain intervention. The pattern was so unusual that it caught his attention, even though he was looking for something entirely different. Further investigation revealed a network of military personnel who had learned and implemented Cordelia's preservation techniques, though most of them had no idea they were part of any larger system. Many of them had continued using variations of the technique in their civilian lives after the war, finding it useful for managing household food supplies and reducing waste. The knowledge had survived in scattered form, preserved in family traditions rather than official documentation. Interviews conducted with surviving participants revealed the full scope of an operation that had functioned completely outside official channels. What had seemed like isolated incidents were actually part of a coordinated system of civilian support that had operated effectively for months without any formal organizations or oversight. The coordination had been achieved through personal relationships and shared knowledge rather than bureaucratic structures. Cordelia had never sought recognition for her contribution, never filed reports about her activities, never requested compensation for the resources she provided, and never attempted to turn her knowledge into any form of personal advantage. Her motivation appeared to have been purely practical. She had skills that could help solve problems, and she used them when the opportunity arose. There was no evidence that she had any political agenda or desire for public recognition. The fermentation method she developed was eventually documented in detail by researchers interested in traditional food preservation techniques who recognized its historical significance. Chemical analysis showed that her specific approach to salt ratios and temperature control produced results that were comparable to modern industrial preservation methods, using only materials that were readily available during wartime shortages. The technique proved to be particularly effective for extending the shelf life of partially damaged vegetables, transforming potential waste into valuable nutrition that could sustain people through extended periods of scarcity. Modern analysis of the preserved foods, recreated using Cordelia's documented methods, showed that the fermentation process created several beneficial compounds that weren't present in the original vegetables. The nutritional profile of the finished product was superior to the raw ingredients in several important respects, making it genuinely more valuable as a food source than conventional preservation methods that simply prevented spoilage without adding nutritional value. More significant than the technical details was the model of civilian preparation and response that Cordelia had demonstrated during those critical months. Her ability to provide immediate, effective assistance during multiple emergencies wasn't the result of luck, exceptional resources, or dramatic gestures. It came from methodical preparation, systematic acquisition of practical knowledge, and a willingness to share both when they were needed most even when doing so required considerable personal sacrifice and offered no prospect of recognition or reward. The model she demonstrated was based on several key principles that remained relevant long after the specific crisis had passed. First was the importance of developing skills before they were needed, rather than trying to learn during an emergency. Second was the value of understanding fundamental principles rather than just following procedures, which allowed her to adapt her methods to different situations and teach others effectively. Third was the power of building relationships and networks before they were needed, creating social capital that could be activated during crises. The house where Cordelia conducted her preservation experiments was demolished in 1971 to make way for a highway expansion project that connected Martinsville to the growing Indianapolis metropolitan area. The wooden barrels she had used for fermentation were donated to the local historical society, where they remained in storage until 1989. By then, most of the people who could have explained their significance had passed away, taking their detailed knowledge with them and leaving only the basic documentation discovered in those municipal records. What survived in the historical record was documentation of a moment when civilian ingenuity had filled critical gaps that official systems couldn't address, when practical knowledge had proved more valuable than bureaucratic procedures, and when quiet preparation had enabled effective response during genuine crisis. The story wasn't about heroic gestures or dramatic rescues that make compelling headlines. It was about someone who had taken the time to learn useful skills, prepare systematically for potential problems, and share solutions generously when they were desperately needed. The records show that Cordelia's direct contribution lasted exactly 43 days, from the first broken-down military truck to the restoration of regular supply lines in mid-April 1945. During that brief window, her basement laboratory and the informal network that grew around it had provided reliable food security for dozens of military personnel who might otherwise have faced serious hardship or health problems. The impact was immediate and practical, but completely unremarkable to anyone who wasn't directly involved in the crisis. This was the true nature of civilian survival during wartime. Not spectacular resistance or heroic sacrifice that captures historical attention, but quiet competence applied consistently when and where it was needed most. The fermentation techniques, the informal networks, and the willingness to help without recognition represented a form of resilience that rarely appears in official histories, but proved absolutely essential to the functioning of society during its most challenging moments. The moral of Cordelia's story wasn't about the specific techniques she developed or even about the particular crisis she helped resolve. It was about the enduring value of systematic preparation, the critical importance of practical knowledge that can function without complex infrastructure, and the remarkable power of community networks to operate effectively without official oversight or bureaucratic approval. In a world where complex systems regularly fail during emergencies, these fundamental principles remain as relevant today as they were during those brutal final months of World War II.